Getting started with hydroponics. Do you need a TDS meter, a pH meter? And what is ppm and EC and what do all these terms mean? It could be very confusing when you're starting with hydroponics, trying to learn what everything is and what you need to get started. Hi, I'm Christy with greenlivingoffgrid.com, and I understand the frustration of being a beginning hydroponic gardener, trying to figure out what you need and trying to understand all of these terms. So today I wanted to do a little video just to explain what these terms are in hydroponics and talk about what you really need when you're getting started with hydroponics. One of the things that you hear a lot when you're talking about hydroponic growing is pH. Well, what is pH? Well, pH is the measurement of acidity to alkalinity in a logarithmic scale from 0 to 14. And what the pH generally tells you is whether your medium, whether you're water or if you're growing in a garden soil, is too alkaline or too acid. And reading of 7 is generally considered the neutral point. And then from 7, on the upper side of the scale, to 8, 9, 10 to 14 is considered alkaline. And anywhere from 6 on down, below 7 on down to 0 is considered acid. Now, most people, when you measure the water coming out of your tap, most people have tap water coming out anywhere from 5 or 5.5 to 8.0. That's generally where water, when you generally get drinking water or potable water, it will generally measure somewhere in that range of 5 to 8. But when it comes to hydroponics, the ideal growing range for pH is 5.5 to 7.0 for most plants. Now, there are a few exceptions. Some plants, like kale, like it a little bit more on the alkaline side, so they can grow in ideal range even up to 7.5. And some plants like it more on the acidic side, like your melons, your berries, fruits, things like that, generally like it more in the 5.5 to 4.5 range on the acidic side of the scale. But generally, anywhere between 5 to 7 pH is an ideal optimum range for maximum absorption of the nutrients in your solution. So what I typically tell people when they're starting with hydroponics and they're trying to figure out, do I need a pH meter? Do I need to be adjusting my pH? Do I need to buy pH up or pH down? Why don't you just start with picking your favorite plants that you want to grow and see how your water does? Because one thing that I discovered when I first started with hydroponics is I picked up a pH meter, measured my well water, and because well water has more calcium ions in it, it tends to be more on the alkaline side, and my water actually measures at 7.8 to 8.0, consistently in that range. And so I was adjusting my pH down, and originally I tried some things like, vinegar can bring your more acidity into your water base, but it's not a stable medium. And if you do try to use household products like that to either make it more alkaline or make it more acidic, it's not going to maintain at that level. So if you do have to adjust pH, generally it's recommended that you get something like the General Hydroponics pH up or pH down, because that actually has a formula that will maintain that pH more in the ideal range that you're trying to go for. So I picked up some General Hydroponics pH down to work with my alkaline water, and I found I was a little bit frustrated with it because when I adjusted the pH, as the plant was growing through its growth cycle, I would see the pH fluctuating. Like, for example, I'd measure the pH in the morning and it would be one number, and then I'd measure it in the afternoon and I'd be like, what's happening to my pH? Why is it adjusting? Well, I didn't realize that there's a number of factors that go into pH changes that occur. As your plant uptakes the nutrients naturally in your hydroponic solution, and as temperatures arise, go up and down throughout the day, your pH levels are going to change. And particularly in a hydroponic solution where the plant is taking out the nutrients, or if your reserve over a period of time starts to get some algae buildup in it, as the algae consumes acidic carbon dioxide during the day, your pH goes up. And then it typically drops back down at night. And I didn't realize why my pH kept going up in the afternoon. Things like that. Algae affects that. And also, as your plant naturally takes up the nutrients and consumes some of that calcium in the water, you're going to see pH go down, or as it takes up some of the acidic compounds, you'll also see it rise. Now, plants generally have a system within themselves to be able to naturally adjust to changes that occur over time in a hydroponic solution or in a soil. And typically when that pH, let's say you started at 5.5 and it starts to climb to 6.5, the plants can naturally accommodate for that. So if you are adjusting your pH, what they have a hard time handling is very quick adjustments. So let's say you started your pH, you're trying to grow something that grows well in 5.5 to 6.5. You're trying to keep it in that ideal range to grow this particular plant. And then you go and you notice, you test your pH and you discover it's 6.5, and you all of a sudden put in your pH down, quickly changing it back to 5.5. That sends your plant into somewhat of a shock. It doesn't, may not manifest right away, but your plant will stress with something like that. It's kind of like having cold water thrown on you on a hot day. Now, you might like that, it might be refreshing, but if it's thrown on you quickly with a big bucket of water, it can send your system into shock. And plants, while they can make those adjustments to that pH changing and doing the internal adjustments needed for the pH, if you're constantly adjusting your pH and putting pH up or pH down in and changing it rapidly like that, it's just going to be more difficult for your plant. It's going to be more stressful situation for your plant. So it's recommended that if you're going to adjust pH, to do so after you've put your nutrients into the water reserve, because that's another thing that changes pH. My pH, when I start my plants with 7.8 water coming out of my well, and then I put my nutrients in, typically my nutrients bring that pH down in an ideal grow zone, an ideal pH for my plants. And so I don't have to go and do a lot of adjustments usually. But if you're trying to get something, say, a little more acidic for your berry plants, and so you measure your pH after you put your nutrients in, once you adjust that pH, and I recommend something like pH up or pH down rather than household products, it's best to leave that alone until you're ready to change your water reserve. Because that, if you do a lot of adjustments and if you continually test it like during the day, and you say you get some algae buildup in your reserve, and you start seeing that pH fluctuating during the day, first of all, you may not get an accurate reading of what's really going on because of algae buildup. And the other thing is your plant is already adjusting for those changes that occur. And so you don't want to send your plant into more stress and potentially shock by doing a lot of changes to pH. So my recommendation to you in answering that question, do you need a pH meter and do you need pH up and down to start hydroponics, is you may not need that. You may, but let's start with what water you have. Start with the plants that you're thinking about growing. And if you see them having any problem, then maybe get some pH up or down and get a pH meter or get some pH drops and test your water and make adjustments accordingly. But what I have found with my well water, adding the nutrients that I use for my hydroponic setup, I really haven't had to do much pH adjustment. And it's really the rare case with some plants that like it a little bit more acidic that I have to adjust my pH down a little bit. But for like here in my aquaponic system, in the greenhouse, where I'm using my fish water, I just put my well water in here. I don't even run an RO system to bring that pH down. I just keep it at whatever level that water comes out in the pH, out in the well, coming out of that well and into my fish tank, and my fish do well, my plants do well normally, and I just don't have to worry about it. And again, the more leafy greens like it more alkaline, so having a hard water like what I have with my well is actually ideal for my leafy greens. So see what your plants will do with your water, and maybe you won't even need to put the cost into a pH equipment meter or pH up or down. And then the second thing that people often get confused about and have a difficult time with when they're starting with hydroponics is TDS. Do you need a TDS meter? What is TDS? Well, TDS is total dissolved solids. And basically what it is a measurement of the electrical conductivity and salts in your solution. Most hydroponic solutions are made up of different kinds of salts which conduct electricity. So to get a TDS reading, a total dissolved solids reading, typically what they will do is they'll measure the electrical conductivity. How well does that water conduct electricity? And they'll get what we call an EC reading, electrical conductivity reading. And then they'll use a formula where they'll multiply that according to a key factor, typically 500 to, some of the meters use 700, to calculate that total dissolved solids reading, that TDS reading. And so typically it's used to be able to know how good a quality you have of water to grow your plants. And so generally you'll see charts that will say things like, lettuce does well with 560 to 840 TDS. And so if you're going to measure TDS and use that as a baseline for growing your plants, you might get a TDS meter, measure your water, your base water, see what it is, and then add your nutrients, and then measure the water after you're adding the nutrients to see what your TDS reading is. And generally, if it's in that range of 560 to 840, you're going to be able to grow lettuce well. And then other plants need it a little bit higher. Tomatoes, for example, like a TDS reading of 1400 to 3500. It has a pretty big, broad range of what tomatoes can handle in the range of TDS. And so generally, I'll start on the lighter side of the scale when I'm starting my tomato plants with, the lower like 1400, 1500 TDS. And then as my plant grows, I'll add more nutrients, a little bit more to the solution, and getting it more in the range of 2800 to 3500 for the large plants. And that helps them grow well. And what about beans? Beans like 1260 to 1540. And broccoli likes 1960 to 2450. So these are just some general ranges for some of the popular crops that you can grow in hydroponics. But the question is, what do you really need? As a beginning gardener using hydroponics, do you need a TDS meter? Well, let me tell you my story. So I picked up a TDS meter when I started, and I started by measuring my well water just to see what my TDS was. And I measured that water, and it came out consistently right around the 90 parts per million ppm reading. Now, ppm is, again, that's the calculation of total dissolved contents, and typically it's parts per million. ppm is what you're looking for, and so calculating that TDS ppm reading, generally the meter or whatever you're using will read that EC, electrical conductivity reading, then use a conversion factor to calculate the parts per million reading, the ppm, and the TDS, total dissolved solids reading. And so I was starting my plants, my lettuce plants, and trying to keep it in that range of ideal, the 560 to 840 range. And with my first meter, it was pretty easy. I had 90 TDS, and so then I would just add the TDS that I needed to make up that difference in that range of 540 to 840, and I would just typically just add some TDS and measure, and if it was anywhere around 600 or 700, I figured that was good for starting my lettuce plants and growing them. But then I had, a couple years later, my meter went out, and I wasn't able to change the battery, and it was one of those cheap meters that, once the battery goes, you got to buy a new one. So I bought another one, but I wasn't able to match the brand of my original meter. I couldn't find it on Amazon, and so I bought a different meter from a different supplier. And when I measured my well water, I was shocked. It gave me a TDS reading of in the 400. I can't remember right now, like 460, and I'm like, that can't be right. My other meter always said that my TDS meter reading was around 90 TDS, 90 ppm. And so how is it that that reading is now giving me a new meter is giving me a reading of 400? Something must be wrong. And I'm thinking, how in the world am I going to use this meter? Because if it's saying I have 400 TDS and I then try to add the nutrients to my reserve to make up that difference in reading to not exceed that 840 on the high side for my lettuce plants, I'm going to be putting in half the nutrients that I put in with my old meter. And I said, my plants aren't going to grow well with half the nutrients. They're doing great with the amount of nutrients I'm putting in now. So what am I going to do? I'm like, I can't use this meter. And I shipped it back to Amazon. I later learned that there is no standard of consistency in the formula that is used to calculate TDS from EC. Now, all meters accurately measure your EC reading, your electrical conductivity, but they use a KE conversion factor using a multiplication anywhere from timesing that EC reading in millisiemens to, timesing it to 500 or timesing it by 700 or 650 or whatever. They use that formula to calculate TDS. And so apparently my first meter was using maybe a lower calculation, using something in the 500 range to multiply my EC reading by a key factor of 500. And then the later meter I got probably was closer to 7. I don't even know, but it was using some formula that was a higher number, base number that it was multiplying the EC by and coming up with a TDS reading 4 times that of my first meter. And that is very confusing for someone who's starting in hydroponics. What do you do with that? When you have readings so different between meters, and especially with a crop like lettuce that has a very small range, 560 to 840, that's ideal for TDS. And you've got a meter that's fluctuating 400 degrees or 300 ppm from your other meter. It's almost impossible to really get it dialed down as to what TDS you should run. And so at that point, I quit using a TDS meter. And I started just following the package directions on my plants. Packages like MaxiGrow, 1 teaspoon to 2 teaspoons per gallon of water. And I'd start with the 1 teaspoon level and see how my plants did. And if they seemed like they needed more, yellowing in the leaves or whatever, they needed more nutrients, I would then up that a little bit more towards the 2 teaspoon as the plant grew. And I discovered that I never have any problems when I do that. The only time I have problems is when I'm not paying attention and I give the adult dose for the large plant to my baby plants, then I might burn my plants. And I've done that a few times, not paying attention. But that usually happens when I'm getting too busy and I just forgot how much nutrients I was mixing up for what plant, and I've done that a few times. But it's not because I didn't know what I needed to do. I just follow the package directions, and it usually is right in range for what you need for your grow. So answering the question we began with, when you're starting hydroponics, do you need a TDS meter? Do you need a pH meter? Do you need to adjust your pH? And as I said before, start with what you have, and if your plants grow great, then you don't need a pH meter. If they don't grow great and you start having problems, then get a pH meter, find out what your water is running at as a base water, then test your pH with the nutrients in your solution and see if it's in that ideal 5.5 to 7.0, or in the case of leafy greens, if it's 7.5, you're probably doing okay. 8, it's pushing a little bit on the scale where they might not get as much absorption as they need, but just watch your plants and you may not need a pH meter. When it comes to TDS, I'm going to say you really don't need a TDS meter. Maybe in aquaponics it can be helpful, because in aquaponics you do have a lot more factors that can affect the pH and the TDS of your water, and so that can be helpful with aquaponics. But with starting with hydroponics, just follow your package directions on your packages, on your nutrients. What do they say? Generally it's a teaspoon per gallon of water, and use that solution dosing amount and see how your plants grow, and you probably won't even need a TDS meter. Well, I hope this is helpful for you. And if you want to learn more about hydroponic growing, let me encourage you to check out our website at greenlivingoffgrid.com and download our free PDF guide, Quick Start Hydroponics, How to Avoid the 5 Most Common Mistakes. just enter your email address and we'll send that PDF guide to you. And also on our website, we have a number of video courses to help you get started with hydroponics. And a good one for a beginning gardener is the Simple Hydroponics video course that uses cracky hydroponics. Using a tray like this, you can start your garden in a cracky setup with 2-inch net pots and certain water reserve. And in my course, I show you exactly how much water to put in, how much nutrients to put in, and how to drill your holes to start your cracky trays. And then also in the Simple Hydroponics course, I also show you how to make a microgreens garden tray that will fit down inside the base of your unit. I show you how to build a little microgreens tray that you can put a water reserve inside the base and have a tray that lays over that water reserve, and you can grow your microgreens inside of your cracky tray. So check out our video course, Simple Hydroponics video course, help you get started with hydroponics, and it will be a really good guide, especially if you've never done this before. I have a lot of helpful tips and tricks to help you know exactly how to set this up, how to get the right lighting for your plants, and answer a lot of the basic questions people have when they're getting started with hydroponics. And for our more advanced hydroponic users, let me encourage you guys to check out our advanced course, which teaches you how to build an aeration grid inside your grow trays, and also how to do not just deep water culture hydroponics with aeration, but an aeroponics unit using sprayers. And we also have a Mr. Stacky grow tower that you can build using ebb and flow and different kinds of systems to be able to run your water in to these Mr. Stacky trays and have a hydroponic grow tower. So check out our advanced course if you're already familiar with cracky hydroponics and you want to do something more complicated, more advanced in your hydroponic growing. Well, thanks for watching, and check out our resources on our website. Don't forget to check out Green Living Off Grid for our hydroponics blog with lots of great videos and different things that'll help you with growing different kinds of plants. And I'll see you again in our next video. Thanks for watching. Happy growing, everyone.